Hello and welcome to the first part of this course that will focus on the concept of the political with the help of Hannah Arendt and Judith Butler, but also some thoughts and input on the idea of political theology. This is just a short introduction to a central concept of Hannah Arendt's thought that I think will help in terms of understanding the book that you are reading. I will enter into into her concept of the political in another short lecture here, or short comment speech. But first of all, Hannah Arendt's idea of thinking. I think few other thinkers advocate the act of thinking as an activity to the same degree as Hannah Arendt does. One could say that for Arendt there is a difference between having thoughts on the one hand and thinking on the other. Simply having thoughts is not the same as thinking. The brain could, of course, in many ways be said to be an organ whose signals is made up of thoughts. In other organs, it uses other signals, but we are not conscious of them. The great difference, for example, between the brain and the stomach, it's not necessarily that the brain controls us more than our stomach does. Some current or recent research has shown that the stomach really controls us to a high degree. So it's not the case that the brain is necessarily more controlling of us. The difference between, for example, the brain and the stomach is the consciousness. We are conscious of the activity of the brain. And we also seem to be able to filter or control and direct the activity of the brain. So we have some influence over the thoughts of the brain. We are all probably have the experience of thoughts simply popping up in our head and seem unable to control them. But once they pop up, we are able to think. So in that way, in a very simplistic way, we could say that thinking is an activity, a controlling of our thoughts. But Arendt puts this further. For thinking in that way seems to be natural or seems to be familiar. But to take Aristotle's understanding of rhetoric, rhetoric is the art of making the least convincing argument into the most convincing argument. So rhetoric is the art of making the least convincing argument into the most convincing argument. So here thinking is an activity as well. One needs to make what seems at the first sight to be have no appeal. One has to turn it, look it into different lights and different perspectives, and to see, is this convincing despite of its first unconvincing appearance? Only when that has been done can one reject the proposition. So the same with Arendt's thinking. It is a turning around of concepts, and it establishes its own conditions. Thinking need not be determined by our sensory experiences. Today we have probably a priority of the empirical over the rational or detached rational thinking. It has not always been the case, but I think it's a good thing that reason and experience go hand in hand. But another point here about thinking is that it doesn't have thinking itself has a priority over our experiences. At least that's what Arendt says, because thinking gives our experiences meaning. And I will quote from Arendt's Life of the Mind. She writes, "All thoughts arises out of experience, but no experience yields any meaning or even coherence without undergoing the operations of imagining and thinking." So no experiences yield any meaning or even coherence without undergoing the operations of imagining and thinking. So Arendt continues to point out that for philosophers like Kant or Plato, life without thinking is like living death. Life without thinking is like living death, because it's a meaningless life. To expound a little more on this quote I just read, Arendt uses not only the term thinking, but also imagining, and in extension the word judging, which you will notice in the book and lectures on Kant. So what Arendt is saying is that we need to reflect on our experiences with categories that do not come from the experiences themselves. So thinking is a separate part from the actual experiences. The categories by which we understand our experiences, they give meaning to our experiences, they come from the life of the mind. So it's due to memory, to thinking, imagination. Of course, they might be some result of some previous experiences, but they are not results of the actual experiences that we are experiences at the moment. That present experience needs to be made meaningful with the help of memory, thinking, and imagination. So our will and judging those experiences becomes meaningful when we are thinking. So memory for Arendt is to put our experiences into a narrative of previous experiences. And thinking, we interpret our experiences. With imagination, in this threefold division in Arendt, memory, thinking, imagination, with imagination we are able to imagine our experiences and place them in the experiences in a different way, which is of course key to the idea of change. We need imagination, not simply thinking or rationality, in order to imagine change. Imagination becomes central for the will to change. And here judging or judgment becomes the second leg of the will to change. Because we need wisdom to judge what change is preferable to the other. And here it's in a way a link to the idea of the political, which I will come to in another talk, where the political is the idea of the common good for Arendt. So how do we judge and imagine the common good for the future from our experiences? So in this way we can understand why not thinking is such a serious offense for Arendt. She's very controversial when she writes in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem that the greatest problem with Eichmann was not that he was evil in that way. She's famous for the quote of the banality of evil. It doesn't quite mean what we might think it means sometimes, but the thing is that Eichmann proved himself unable to think, which is why he became a bureaucrat and an anonymous representative of evil for Arendt. Would he have been able to think? There are critique of Arendt here that Eichmann was not at all as docile as he might have seemed in the court. But still, would he have been able to think in the way that Arendt is saying that thinking as an activity? It would have been different as Arendt sees it. Because if Eichmann would have been able to think and not simply just having thoughts, he would have seen that he needed to act against the majority in the Nazi bureaucracy. He would have been able to understand and imagine things differently. He would have had a judgment to say the common good needs to be this instead of that. It needs to be undermining the Holocaust instead of supporting the Holocaust, and so on. So, in this way, of course, texts and books like we find in this course that might be challenging, might be complex, might be difficult, is necessary in order to practice our thinking, in order to imagine things differently. It's difficult to imagine things differently. It's easy to simply having thoughts. So the hope here is that by beginning in Arendt and her idea of thinking is that you will enter into the reading with a sense of this is good for our thinking and this is good for the imagination, good for the ability to think things differently. So that's how Arendt's ideas of the life of the mind, of memory, of thinking, and of imagination, and as an addition to that you will find in the book that you're reading, of judgment, enters into this course.